Hello and welcome to the Cotton Academy's third Year 10 lesson on the Holocaust. Today you're going to be looking at the Nazis' final solution and you're going to be looking at what they did between 1942 and 1945. There are no sheets to print for this lesson. Whether you've got a printer or not, you're all going to be doing exactly the same notes. Now you should have already had an introduction with your teacher on Teams. Please do let them know if you haven't already that you're here and completing the work. And remember, in the last 5 minutes of the lesson at least, you need to be back in Teams to contribute to the plenary. Make sure you keep these notes safe as you're going to need them later on. So today, as you already know, you're looking at the Nazis' final solution. Now, this is because they considered themselves to have a Jewish problem and they believed the final solution was to try and murder all of the Jewish people in Europe. So today we're going to be looking at that third and final phase of the treatment of the Jews in Germany and across the German Reich. Remember, in the first lesson of the Holocaust, we looked at those three phases, the first one being a period of discrimination between 1933 and 1937, the second one being a period of violence with 1938 Kristallnacht all the way up to the Eisengruppen in 1941, and today we're thinking about 1942 to 1945. So write down that title if you haven't already. We're going to start with watching a quick clip which is going to give you an introduction to what we're going to be studying for the rest of the lesson. You don't need to make any notes, just listen carefully to it because it's going to give you the context for what we're studying.
Would coalesce into something called the final solution, which would be a policy of murdering all Jews everywhere across the face of Europe. In late 1941, the Nazis set off the first extermination camp. During the course of 1942, they would set up 5 more extermination camps. Jews from ghettos in Eastern Europe were sent by train to the extermination camps, as were Jews from transit camps throughout Western Europe. As the war unfolded, they needed would coalesce into something called the final solution, which would be a policy of murdering all Jews everywhere across the face of Europe. In late 1941, the Nazis set off the first extermination camp. During the course of 1942, they would set up 5 more extermination camps. Jews from ghettos in Eastern Europe were sent by train to the extermination camps, as were Jews from transit camps throughout Western Europe.
So you've just been introduced to the horror of the final solution. Now we're going to talk through it in more detail. I'm going to talk to you about the context of what Hitler saw as the Jewish problem, and then we're also going to look at what the experience was like for so many Jews that lost their lives or had their lives altered forever by their experiences in these camps. So to start with, we're going to think about what do we mean by the Jewish problem. Now, obviously, we know that the Nazi Party was incredibly anti-Semitic and anti-Jewish, and they blamed the Jews for all the different problems that Germany experienced. The loss of the First World War, economic problems like hyperinflation and the Great Depression. We know that Jews were the scapegoats for all of Germany's problems. Now, there'd already been 500,000 Jews that there had been in Germany, but as the Nazis expanded and took over other nations, and especially during the war, then when they invaded other places, they ended up having a greater Jewish population that they saw as an increasingly bad problem. So remember that in Germany there were 500,000, but in places like Austria there was about 180,000 Jews, and in Poland there was over 3 million. Remember that Hitler had invaded that in September 1939. Now, by the time we're getting to the decision of the final solution, the end of 1941, the beginning of 1942, there are 11 million Jewish people that Hitler has under his control, and he therefore wants to try and get rid of them by any means possible. So when we're talking about the final solution, it's a horrible phrase, but it's one used to describe the Nazi ideas, and it's the final solution to what the Nazis saw as the Jewish problem. I'd like you to pause the video here and make a few notes about what the Jewish problem was according to the Nazis. Now they've got their Jewish problem, the Nazis wanted to try and solve this, and they decided to talk about it at a conference that happened in January 1942 at Wannsee, which is just outside Berlin. You can see a picture of it here on the top right, this very grand building. Now, Hitler wasn't at this meeting. It was led instead by Heydrich, who was one of the key Nazis and is known as the man with the iron heart. So you can understand what this man is like. Now, in this conference, they discussed the final solution to the Jewish problem, the idea that they were going to try and murder every Jew in German territory, either by working them to death or killing them in poisonous gas chambers. From late 1941, they had started to murder Jewish people in the backs of big lorries and trucks, using gas, using carbon monoxide, which they fed into them. They'd also been experimenting since 1939 with murdering disabled people through gas, and they decided that they wanted to create all these mass camps with the purpose of killing as many Jewish people as they could each day. They discussed at this conference the 11 million Jews of Europe. There's a document that you can see that's just come up here, which totals each of the countries and how many Jewish people they had. And they disgustingly planned at this conference to try and murder up to 60,000 Jewish people a day. Now, it wasn't only Jewish people that they wanted to kill. They also wanted to murder anybody that was Roma or Sinti, might be known as the Gypsies, but also people that were their opponents or people that they considered unfit to live. They also did this to lots of Eastern prisoners of war, for instance, people that came from areas like the Soviet Union. So the final solution is decided in January 1942 at Wannsee, but there are lots of historians that talk about that the decision had been made. This was just them formalising it at the beginning of 1942. Pause the video here and make some notes about the Wannsee Conference and what they meant by the final solution. In order to carry out the final solution, the Nazis wanted to create some specific death camps which would have the facilities to be able to murder so many innocent Jewish people each day. Now, what I want you to look at here is this diagram of the concentration camps and the death camps, and it's really important that you know the difference between them. Concentration camps have been around since March 1933, the first of them being created in Dachau in the south of Germany. Now, from 1933, they had been putting in there anybody that was a political opponent, anybody that was a trade unionist or a socialist or a communist. But by 1936, they had started to arrest other people as well. For instance, people that were gay were put into these camps and treated really, really brutally. Now, these camps were around for a long time, as we mentioned, from 1933, and you can see that there are lots of these camps within Germany itself. For instance, there's one called Sachsenhausen, which isn't that far away from Berlin. However, these really did differ from the extermination camps that are built towards the end of 1941 and 1942. And all the death camps you can see are done by the red swastika, and you can see that the majority of them are in Poland. Places like Auschwitz-Birkenau, that we'll talk about more later this lesson, places like Treblinka you've probably heard of before, Belzec, there's loads of different camps, each of them absolutely horrifying for the people that experience them. So you can see the different dates and when they were all created here. Remember, they finalised the final solution, the details of it, at the Wannsee Conference in January 1942, though most historians believe that they made this decision and started preparing for the final solution later on in 1941. Okay, so you don't have to write anything down here if you don't want to, but it might be a good idea to at least put down when a couple of these camps were created. Personally, I'd put ones down like Auschwitz-Birkenau and then let you pick another one to make a couple of notes on. So far, we've had a bit of an introduction where we've thought about what the camps actually were and when were those decisions made. But the problem with that is that even though you need to know those notes for an exam, you're missing the human element of this and about the reality for ordinary people that suffered unimaginably in these camps. So what we're going to focus on for the rest of the lesson is thinking about what was life like in these camps for these people that had to go through this horrifying experience. So we've mentioned the majority of these extermination camps were in Poland. The Nazis didn't want them to be in Germany itself, because even though the German population certainly had a rough or vague idea and had rumours about what was going on, the Germans didn't want them to see the reality of it, because it might have led to some opposition. So they created these in places like Poland. Now, for ordinary Jewish people, they were shipped from all over Europe to these death centres. You can see in this map in the top right about all the different areas where people came from that were then brought to Auschwitz. Some of these people had to go on train journeys that would take weeks to be able to get there, not knowing what their fate was. Now, often the Nazis would lie to them about what was going on. When they picked them up, they told them that they were going to be resettled in the east. They were going to be given some land in somewhere like Siberia that wouldn't be pleasant, but they certainly didn't know that they were going to their deaths. Now, these journeys were absolutely horrendous. The conditions that they were kept in were absolutely sickening. So we're going to talk about those details and talk about the cattle trucks. You can see pictures of the cattle trucks in the bottom right hand side, and in the middle picture you can see that they were transported not on a passenger train but actually a proper cattle truck. So thinking about specifically Auschwitz, which is going to be our main focus for today, the first trains carrying Jews arrived in Auschwitz in March 1942. They arrived almost every day from every country in Europe. Now, each of these trains carried in excess of 1,000 victims. It was all organised by a man called Eichmann, who was one of the people that was there at the Wannsee conference, and he coordinated all of the transports of prisoners. Now, these people aren't coming from their homes, remember. The majority of them have already been rounded up and put into ghettos, places like the Warsaw Ghetto that we studied last lesson. They were packed into these cattle wagons with no room to sit, no food, and often only 2 buckets, one that had a very limited amount of water and another to use as a toilet. Now imagine that for weeks on end potentially, or certainly at least days, being in these terrible conditions of no windows, no ability for any privacy to go to the toilet. It would have been absolutely horrendous for those people, and I can't even begin to imagine the experience, the smell, the fear that they would have been feeling. The journey could last for days on end, with the prisoners not knowing where they were passing through or where they were going. Lots of victims actually died during the journey as a result of suffocation, illness, or hunger. And obviously people died of things like dehydration as well, because there was a very limited amount of water. The Nazis didn't care if the passengers died, because they believed that they were just the weaker ones that couldn't be worked anyway, so they didn't see it as an issue. Initially, arrivals at Auschwitz-Birkenau would be unloaded onto a ramp alongside the main railway. The prisoners would then walk the short distance to the camp. However, when they started to have larger numbers of people arriving at one time, for instance the 440,000 Hungarian Jews during the spring of 1944, they then laid the very famous tracks directly into the camp. If you've ever seen a picture of Auschwitz before, you've probably seen the railway tracks that go straight into it, and that's what they built in 1944. On arrival at Auschwitz-Birkenau, the trains would pull up on the unloading ramp in front of the awaiting SS officers and guards and the Sonderkommando. Jews were then thrown out of the railway wagons, as you can see in this picture in the middle here, and made to leave their belongings behind them. They were then ordered to form lines ready for the selection process. This was when the Nazis selected which Jews would be sent to their deaths in the gas chambers and which Jews would remain alive temporarily. Remember that anybody that was pregnant, old, or even too young would absolutely have been sent to be murdered straight away. A really shocking statistic at the bottom is that more than 80% of those who arrived in Auschwitz-Birkenau were immediately murdered, usually within an hour of getting there. And the majority that remained, or the majority of the remainder, died as a result of overwork, mistreatment, disease, or lack of food. We'll talk about some individual experiences afterwards, but you might even remember from the first Holocaust lesson the experience of that young boy, Arik Hirsch, who was only about 14 when he went to Auschwitz, and he described the horror of living. So even the people that we see as being the lucky ones that have managed to survive this horrendous ordeal are obviously shaped and scarred by it for the rest of their lives. So I only want you to make very brief notes on what it was like for them in the journey, during the journey, and when they get to Auschwitz. So you can pause it here to do that. I think most importantly is to get down this bottom statistic here about the 80%. I think that's the really key bit to make sure you've got down. So the entire time we're thinking about the Holocaust, we are thinking about the scale of it and the fact that 6 million people lost their lives. But I also think it's really important that we talk about individuals. You know, we talked about Eric Hirsch in that first lesson. We've seen some examples throughout. And now we want to think about the experience of a man called Primo Levi, an Italian Jew, who describes the first few days as a prisoner in Auschwitz. This is what he says. Nothing belongs to us anymore. They have taken away our clothes, our shoes, even our hair. If we speak, they will not listen to us, and if they listen, they will not understand. They will even take away our name. My number is 174517. We will carry the tattoo on our left arm until we die. So this shows you the horror for the ordinary people that experience this, the dehumanizing process. We haven't talked about that yet, but essentially, once they got there, they had their heads shaved and they had their clothes taken away. They stopped referring to them by their name, and instead they gave them a number. All of this is part of the dehumanizing process to make them not seem as individuals now, but just another member serving the state. I'm now going to show you a video tour of Auschwitz so you can get a sense of what it was like there and the experience of different prisoners. Now, I thought about the 6 million Jewish people that had been killed a lot of times before I went on a school trip to go and visit it. But I think it really hits home when you see things in this video about the scale of it and how many people 6 million really is. I think it's quite easy for us to reiterate that number and use it all the time. But when you think of each of them being an individual with their own hopes and dreams and their own personality, their own life experiences, it becomes quite overwhelming to think about how many people perished as a result of these crimes committed by the Nazis. Just want to warn you, this is quite upsetting, but I think it's really important that you see the reality of the Holocaust as well. Okay, so that was a sign that says work makes you free. The Nazis used to have that up on the front of all concentration and extermination camps to make it seem as if people could get out of it. Here you can see all of the different gates. You can see the fact that they were trapped in here. There would have been Nazi guards standing there with guns. You can see the watchtower in the far right corner, that black building. Now, this area that we're seeing here isn't actually in the extermination camp area, but these are some of the places where people would have stayed. You can see the scale of it here, how many buildings. It's a really great place if you can go and visit to really understand the reality of the Holocaust. I mean, the numbers are astonishing. In Auschwitz alone, over 1.1 million Jewish people were murdered. There's lots of memorials to them, like we just saw there. The Holocaust Centre has done a really good job of trying to find out about who all the victims were of the Holocaust, who were all the individuals affected by this, because there's not that many documents that remain, but there have been people that have spent their lives now finding out about who all these victims were and publishing things about their lives and their photos to make sure we can remember them properly. You can see in this photo the sheer numbers of people that would arrive after one transit. Remember, they become those cattle trucks that we looked at before. And I think this is unbelievably shocking to look at. Zyklon-free gas canisters. And this pile here is all the glasses. Now, they actually sold a lot of the glasses when they came in, so this is what just remained when they liberated the camp in January 1945. Here, this is a case that they've got just of prosthetic limbs. So think about the small numbers of people that have a prosthetic limb and how many are there in this museum. It gives you a real sense of the numbers of people that had been murdered. Here we've got things like pots and pans. I think what's really heartbreaking about this is the fact that people felt they were going somewhere that they would need these materials. They needed to pack things like pans. And then we can see people's suitcases with their addresses on, people really hoping they'd be reunited with their property. And obviously people would be packing their valuables in there. The Nazis wanted them to pack. They wanted to make sure that people packed all their best belongings because they then wanted to exploit that and take that stuff. We can see some of the clothes that people had to remove when they got there as part of the dehumanising process. And all the shoes. Now, these are piled really high. I wish I could give you some kind of sense of how many there are. And if you go and see it, it is truly shocking. If you're thinking about a very tall person, being about 6 foot, this display of shoes goes above those people's height. You can see how much they're packed in, and it goes on for about 2 classrooms worth of length, just of shoes. And remember that they sold a lot of these as well. When you're looking at these, you can sometimes see the shoes of children as well. Here we've got shaving equipment. It is really heartbreaking to go to this and to see the reality of what happened, the sheer numbers of people. One of the really big issues that we have at the moment is there are a lot of people that are Holocaust deniers that suggest that either the Holocaust didn't happen or it didn't happen in the scale that people said it did. Now, the BBC did a study recently and they found that 1 in 12 people in Britain believes that about the Holocaust, that it wasn't as bad as the Jewish people made out. And when you see videos like this, I find it very difficult to believe that anyone could deny what had happened to so many people. We have video evidence, we have photographic evidence, we have evidence of all these people's belongings that have been left. There is so much evidence to support what happened, and it's really important that we talk about this to other people and that we remember the horrors of this and what led to it to make sure that it never happens again. And here we have some of the photos of some of the victims of the Holocaust. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of work has gone on to try and find who these people were and rehumanise them again, give them back their identity again. As you can see here, some of these people are children. Over 1.5 million Jewish children were murdered as part of the Holocaust. And you can see here the typical clothes that they would wear in these concentration camps and extermination camps. They would wear these in the winter and in the summer. Now remember that places like Germany can get really cold. Places like Poland can get really cold. It can easily be -10 degrees. and they only have those small amount of clothes with them. You can see here the result of starvation, living on only about 300 calories a day, and how much your body would deteriorate. Not only do they not have any food, but remember they're doing harsh physical labour all the time as well. So a lot of the memorials focus on that starvation and the misery of what they experienced. So we're coming to the end of this video now. Just wanted to give you a little bit of an understanding of what it is like in places like Auschwitz. So you remember the horrors and you understand what people went through. When we're talking about these survivors, you know, if you're watching a survivors clip on YouTube, think about, you know, what these people have gone through. And you can see this in the video. You've now seen the video introduction to Auschwitz. I'm just going to show you a few more pictures because there are some areas that the video doesn't show you and the reality of the living conditions in this place. So we can see here things like the toilet block on the bottom left. You can see the fact that there's no privacy. You can imagine how horrendous it was. You know, there's no flushing toilets, no plumbing. It would have been a really grim experience. You can see on the bottom right hand side as well the wash basins in the prisoners' sanitation block. Now they were told that they could only have a couple of minutes to wash in the morning, but clean water was rarely supplied. People might have a bucket, and if you were the first one it might be relatively clean, but obviously if you've got up to 1,000 people sharing a couple of buckets of water, you can imagine the condition it would be in by the time you get halfway through. You can also see on the top left the places that they would have to sleep with no bedding, not even having your own space. You could have up to 10 people cramped into one of those bunk beds. There are lots of experiences of people where people had died in the night and people next to them had to then deal with their dead bodies. It must have been a really shocking and stark reminder of the reality of their life, and I find it really difficult to even comprehend the horror that people went through, but they really did. So if you want to, you could write down some things about living conditions in Auschwitz, but I think more important than writing it down is understanding the reality of what this final solution and this Nazi decision led to. You've now thought about the Holocaust. You've looked at how it evolved over time and how it started in 1933 with the discrimination of Jewish people, how it evolved in 1935 with the Nuremberg laws. You've thought about the policies of violence from 1938 with Kristallnacht. You've seen about the ghettos in 1939. You've seen about the Eisengruppen, who were carrying out mass shootings of thousands of people by the summer of 1941. And you've seen about the final solution, which technically began after January 1942 with the Wannsee Conference and them deciding to try and murder 11 million European Jews. You've seen the reality of it with 6 million people that had been murdered by the Nazis that were Jewish. But we're also now going to think for this final bit of the lesson about the other victims of the Holocaust. There are 6 million Jewish people that perish in these terrible camps from starvation or execution. But there's also another 5 million people that are murdered by the Nazis in these areas. So in total, the Nazis had 11 million people that they murdered in so many brutal ways. Now we're going to talk about these other groups, and I'd like you, once I finish talking through it, to pause the video and make a spider diagram of the other groups and how they were persecuted by the Nazis. The main information is on the board here, but you can also add, if you want to, the extra things I'm going to say about each of these groups. So first of all, I want to talk to you about the Roma and the Sinti, otherwise sometimes known as the Gypsies. Now we have to be aware that these groups of people were subjected to much of the same treatment as Jewish people. The Nazis viewed the Jews as a biological threat to the Aryan race, and they viewed the Roma and the Sinti as the same, as a threat to the Aryan race. So things like the Nuremberg laws we looked at in 1935 that made Jews second-class citizens and stopped them from marrying Aryans, those same laws were actually applied to people that were Roma and Sinti. So they were also targeted for discrimination. Basically, everything that happened to Jewish people also happened to them too, and they were also sent to extermination camps. It's estimated that about 500,000 European gypsies were murdered just like the Jews in these same forms with things like gassings. So the Roma and Sinti were really badly treated by the Nazis. There's less talked about with them and there's less known about it because there hasn't been as many charities that have focused on the response to the Nazi policies towards the Roma and Sinti. But that doesn't mean it's any less important. And if you're interested in knowing more, please just message me and I can send you some really interesting information about what happened to so many innocent Roma and Sinti people. The next group that you need to know about are the asocials. These are people that the Nazis classed as people not fitting into their ideal society. For instance, people that were work shy, that were unemployed, people that were alcoholics, prostitutes, or homosexual. These people were supposedly to the Nazis a threat to their society, and they therefore wanted to try and re-educate them. So they rounded them up in 1936 before the Berlin Olympics and put them into concentration camps. The idea was that they'd release them after a few years when they'd learnt to behave better. So for instance, many innocent gay people were rounded up, put in concentration camps and had to wear a pink triangle that showed that they were in there because they were gay. They suffered really brutal treatment and the guards knew exactly what their apparent crime was according to them, and they would treat them accordingly. So homosexuals in particular were very badly treated by the Nazis, and they did this because they felt that people that were gay were a threat to their nation. Remember, the Nazis were incredibly worried about the declining birth rate, and that's why they had so many policies to encourage women to have lots of children. Now, it's not only people that are asocials that are horrendously treated, but it's also people that were physically or mentally disabled. People that had a hereditary illness, that's one that could pass to the next generation. They were sterilised from 1933. About 400,000 people were forcibly sterilised, and they had the right and ability to have children taken away from them. And that could happen to you from the age of 13. So there's a lot of people who had their whole futures determined by the Nazis from 1933. Even worse, in 1939, the Nazis decide that sterilising these people isn't going far enough, and they saw them as such a threat to the race that they decided to murder people through a policy of euthanasia. So people with disabilities, particularly if they were hereditary, were murdered often through gassings, but in some cases through a policy of starvation. Their families would be told that they were getting the best medical treatment, but then they would carry out these murders and then tell them that they had died of some kind of infection. So ordinary German people, people that were supposedly of the Aryan race, are still murdered by the Nazis if they're seen as a threat to the race in any way. For instance, being disabled would have been seen as a threat. By 1944, the Nazis had murdered 200,000 people, adults and children, through this policy of euthanasia. And most argue that the gas that they used here was the origins of the Holocaust and gave them the idea, which they then later applied to Jewish people from the end of 1941 to the beginning of 1942. So it isn't just Jewish people that experience the horrors of the Nazis and have, these brutal treatments and, being treated so inhumanely. It happens to many different groups. However, obviously the scale of what happens to Jewish people means that we often do focus on that because we're thinking about those 6 million Jewish people that have been murdered. But remember, there are also millions of other people from different minorities that are persecuted and murdered by the Nazis. So I'd like you to pause the video here and make a spider diagram of notes on those other groups. You've now got to the end of the YouTube clip for this video. Hopefully you'll be able to join your teacher now for the last 5 minutes, where we're going to be asking you a really important question about who is actually responsible for the Holocaust. Would we say people are equally responsible? Would we suggest that one person or a group is more responsible? We're going to be debating that for the last 5 minutes of the lesson. Now, if you happen to have finished earlier than the last 5 minutes, what I'd like you to do is carry out some additional research. You could pick to look at a specific location like Auschwitz, you could look at a specific area like the journeys on the cattle trucks, or you could even look up specific Nazis responsible for the horrors of the Holocaust. For instance, you could look at the man that I've got at the top there, a man called Adolf Eichmann, who is responsible for the transportation of Jewish people. Or you could look at Reinhard Heydrich, who we can see at the bottom there, who was the person that led the Wannsee Conference. So either carry out that research or go back to your teacher on Teams, and thank you for doing the work from today.